What's going on, ladies, gents, and kids of all ages? It is Eric coming back at you once again from the Nerd Cave, and today we have another fantastic episode planned for you, doing something a little bit different, and then we'll be getting back to deck tech videos at the end of the week. I got some more cool decks coming, and we've talked about some of the best possible decks to play for set championships over the last several weeks, so if you haven't checked out those videos, definitely check them out if you're still trying to decide what you should be playing for set championships. Something that somebody had asked about recently on a post I had put out there, just generally about deck building, is what are the fundamentals of deck building? How do I become a better deck builder? I hear people comment all the time that they struggle with building decks. They feel like they make choices that don't work out, or they try to do something creative and it doesn't pan out for them. So I did want to talk a little bit about the basic fundamentals of deck building. So I have 5 tips that are really going to help you get over the hump of how to build a deck that is going to be competitive. And this is going to apply to every single deck across every single color. This is going to be general tips for building decks. If this video gets 50 likes, we may look at doing another video in this series and maybe another video after that with more in-depth guides on how to do different things when it comes to deck building, how to build around specific strategies if that's something people are interested in. We have a lot of ideas on how we should go about doing these how-to videos. If you're enjoying this, slap that like button. If you want to support me directly, like the wonderful folks that we have in our Patreon, big shout out to those guys. You can pop over to our Patreon, link in the description. We are going to be adding a new $1 tier that's going to get you a little more limited access, but if you're somebody who wanted to support us more directly and didn't want to get into the $5 or $10 tier, the $1 tier is going to be coming, so keep an eye out for that. But without any further ado, let's talk about the top 5 fundamentals for building a competitive deck. The first, and maybe one of the most important things when it comes to deck building, is going to be making sure that your deck has a curve. You may have heard people say curve before and been like, what is a curve? Why do I need my deck to have a curve? What does that even mean? Well, a curve, it refers to how your deck is going to play across multiple turns. So say, for instance, you played a deck that consisted of 60 cards that cost 1. That deck is not going to have what they refer to as a curve. That deck is going to go turn 1, 1 drop, turn 2, 2 more 1 drops. It's just going to keep playing 1 drops. A curve is going to be taking advantage of all of the ink to play bigger and more effective cards as those turns progress. So turn 1, you want to play a 1 cost card. Turn 2, play a 2 cost card. Turn 3, play a 3 cost card. And if you can get that type of curve into multiple turns, you can always have effective threats to be challenging what your opponent is doing. Are some people going to play into a lower cost curve strategy? For sure. And some people are going to play with what they refer to as a higher curve with more expensive cards. This is going to be a meta decision. So if you're playing in a meta where everyone's playing hyper aggro, maybe reduce your curve a little bit and have more 1 and 2 drop cards. Whereas if you're playing in a meta where everyone's playing what they refer to as mid-range, then maybe go ahead and increase the amount of 3 cost and 4 cost cards in your deck to be effective in that meta, to be able to challenge the opponent's threats that they're putting in front of you. I would say in most instances for the average deck, you want the bulk of the cards to cost 4 or less, with probably 20 to 50% of your deck falling into that boat, and definitely a lot of those being in the 1 to the 3 drop slot, probably like a third to a half of your deck being in that 1 to 3 drop slot more specifically, and then a lot of decks will have some 4 drops and so on and so forth. So that is going to be the basic fundamentals of how to make sure your deck has an appropriate curve. Number 2, and another very important thing when it comes to playing Disney Lorcana, is going to be ink access. Uninkables can be some of the best cards in Disney Lorcana. You look at examples like Be Prepared and Whole New World. These are cards that a couple sets ago people were calling for to be banned. They're both uninkables and they're both very good, and there's lots of other great uninkables in the game like Lucky Dime. There's even cheap uninkables like Ice Block. And while uninkables are great, they're going to potentially stifle your deck if you play too many. If you end up causing yourself to be kind of ink starved, you're not going to be able to play into that curve we were talking about in step 1. If you have something to ink turn 1, you play a 1 cost, great. If you go into turn 2 and you're holding a handful of uninkables, you're only able to play another 1 cost. And particularly if your deck does have an appropriate curve, you may not have another 1 cost in your hand. So you want to always make sure your uninkable count is low enough for your deck to be effective. I would say unless you're playing Sapphire, which has some ability ability with Fishbone Pro and stuff like that to ramp with cards that are not inkable. A general rule of thumb is to play probably 16 or less uninkables. I see some people say 14 and 15 is the sweet spot. I think you can get away with 16 in most regular decks if your curve isn't super high. If you're playing a deck where you want to get up into those 6, 7, 8 cost cards, you're not only going to want to have a lot of inkable cards in that deck to be able to make sure you're inking consistently turn over turn, but typically you're going to have additional draw resources to be able to fulfill that deck's need for ink. So always make sure you're not playing too many uninkables, and that being said, make sure you're choosing the absolute best uninkables to fill those very limited slots in your deck. Next up, in a very important part of deck building, it may not refer to the specific cards you're going to play, but it does refer to the specific strategy you're going to bring to the game, and that is going to be a plan. You want to always have a plan for how your deck is going to get from 0 lore to 20 lore over the course of that game, and not only do that, but be able to do it before your opponent can do it. This can be done through either controlling the board and making sure your opponent doesn't have the characters that they need to quest, or that the characters that they do have out aren't able to quest. That can be accomplished a number of different ways, either by simply removing those characters your opponent has in play, or by playing as many threats as you can so your opponent can't be questing. They are going to have to be dealing with your threats, and in that position you can potentially take advantage of getting ahead on lore by just questing in their face while they're having to challenge in and deal with your threats. Every time you're challenging and taking a trade, it's one less lore that you're getting over the course of that game. If your opponent's able to do that enough, they can definitely chip away at that lore before you can. Other potential options to control the board in addition to removal are going to be discard options. So you look at something like Emerald, where you have access to Sudden Chill and Ursula, two of the best discard cards in the game. One can be sung for 2, and the other one not only reveals your opponent's hand, but lets you choose a song card to take away from it. So that can be a fantastic way, again, to control what your opponent is doing and make sure they're not able to reach 20 lore before you. There are really the two primary paths, and the alternative path is going to be the simple, speedy path. This is fantastic for new players. If you're somebody who doesn't understand the mechanics, like I hear people say all the time that they're confused by the Merlin Mim bounce package. They just really don't play it well. They don't understand the mechanics well enough. They end up playing stuff at the wrong time or playing things out of sequence when they could have potentially taken advantage of additional triggers. And this can be a pitfall for new players. So typically you want to play to your best ability. So you want to be able to play a deck that is going to suit you the best. And if that is an aggro deck, play an aggro deck. Just play something where you're throwing guys out as fast as you can, questioning your opponent's face. I've seen many aggro decks where they go turn 1 Daisy Duck, turn 2 another Daisy Duck, and another 1 drop, and then by turn 3, especially if they drop a Donald, they've already quested up to 9, and you can absolutely just steamroll somebody before they can even do anything about it. Daisy is incredibly difficult to deal with. So keep that in mind. There are two primary strategies, either controlling your opponent or playing as speedy as you can and just racing them to 20 lore. And that is going to be your primary plan in that matchup, but what is equally important to building a deck is going to be an effective backup plan. What do I mean by this? Maybe you have a deck that wants to be able to play a lot of big heavy control cards and control the board, but your opponent is playing discard and they are making you discard things. Well, in that situation, you're not going to be able to take advantage of those heavy resources. So having a counterbalance to something like discard, if you know it is a weak matchup for you, is going to be super important. The best counterbalance into discard in this specific example is going to be cards that just let you draw more cards. So playing things like Diablo in the early game that's going to let you draw additional cards is going to really help you against discard, because they may be trying to deal with your board, preventing you from quests, making you discard, but then when those Diablos die, they're refilling your hand, which is kind of balancing out some of that discard you're doing and potentially getting you to those bigger threats and having enough possible cards to ink. Particularly in a super heavy discard matchup, sometimes the best thing you can do in those early turns is just play stuff that lets you draw more cards. Another great example of a backup plan is playing something like a Baloo or a Merlin Goat when you're playing against somebody whose deck is heavily focused on removal. Maybe you have a deck that wants to be questing quick, racing your opponent to that 20 lore. Well, when your opponent starts removing all your characters, or they make it to that turn where they're able to play something like Be Prepared and wipe your board, all of a sudden it doesn't feel so good. But so by playing things like Baloo and Merlin Goat, you are potentially able to close out those games with uninteractable lore. Baloo, as soon as he's banished, he's going to be gaining you 2 lore, and Goat, when he comes down and when he leaves, is going to be gaining you 1. There's literally nothing an opponent can do about a Goat that's going to prevent it from gaining you 1 lore, except for the set 6 Peter Pan, which is kind of interesting, and we may be talking about that in a future deck list, so stick around for that. Another great example of having a counterbalance to a matchup that may not be good for you is playing something like Locations against Amber Steel. They have a super hard time dealing with locations. Ruby Sapphire can typically have a hard time dealing with locations, so sometimes just having a couple locations in your deck can be your answer to what might otherwise be a bad matchup. And this may go without saying, but number 5 is super important, and that is to just play your deck effectively. You could build or be handed the best deck in the world, and if you have no idea how to play it, it's not going to feel good to you. Kind of cut back to me talking about some people having a hard time with that Merlin Mim bounce package. Well, some people also really struggle with Ruby Sapphire. Ruby Sapphire is a fantastic deck. I'm going to be the first person to tell you it's incredibly complicated to play. There's a lot of triggers that you have to think about, and you have to make sure that you're doing them in the right order to take the best possible advantage of all of your cards to be able to out-resource your opponent into the late game. It's a very interesting deck to play, but it's not a deck that I would necessarily recommend to a new Lorcana player. Build and play something that fits your play style. Know what your best hand looks like in various matchups and what you should play first. Maybe if you're playing Ruby Amethyst, for instance, you want to go turn one Chernabog or turn 1 Magic Broom, since they're going to have some attack and they're going to be able to be a little more of a threat to the board. However, if you're playing into something like Steel Song, that may not be your best turn 1. Your best turn 1 is probably going to be that Diablo if you're playing it, because when Steel Song removes that card, you're still going to be drawing a card. Whereas with those other two, if Steel Song's removing them, or a Steel deck in general is removing them through something like Fire the Cannons, without you being able to draw a card, it's not going to feel great. Whereas with Diablo, you're still going to get that card draw, which may potentially create a situation where your opponent isn't even going to want to banish it, but we won't go too far down the Diablo hole. Practice, 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 and not just against decks that you have a good matchup against. Play against your worst possible matchups. If you're somebody who doesn't have the ability to practice with another opponent, I always recommend playing solitaire with your decks, kind of playing a single-sided game. And when you're doing that, pretend that your opponent is getting absolute gas the whole time. Like they're doing the worst possible thing they could do every turn. They're wiping your characters, and see if you still feel good about where your deck is at. And then you may know, should I tweak this thing? Is this thing working or not working, even without an opponent to play against? There's also multiple online options to play Lorcana, so if you're not taking advantage of those, definitely run a Google search. I'm not going to talk about the specific options. You also want to play in a way that's going to be kind of predictive to what your opponent is most likely to do next, particularly in some of those matchups against things like Steel Song, against Ruby Sapphire, Ruby Amethyst. People know what those deck lists look like in and out, so you can kind of play against what your opponent's most likely next turn is. However, you also want to play in a way that's going to be flexible. If you can give yourself a backup plan, it's always going to be a better position to be in than if you don't have a backup plan. For instance, if you're going into a matchup and you're playing something like Ruby Amethyst into a Steel deck, and you go turn 1 guy and they banish it, and you don't, and your turn 2 is going to be Madam Mim Snake, that's not going to feel so good, because all of a sudden you're not doing anything on turn 2. So if you could be able to have a alternative turn 2, or maybe another 1-drop, mulligan for that and present a strategy that's going to be flexible, particularly over the opening turns of the game. Take your time and look at the board, look at the lore, look at how many cards your opponent has in your hand. Make the best possible decision you can in that particular moment based on the facts in front of you. Don't just go through the motions of the deck. It's the worst possible thing that you can do. I've seen people do things like turn 3 aerial, knowing that their opponent's going to do something that can just straight up banish their aerial before they're able to take advantage of it, outside of, I guess, getting that song out of their top deck. That is not a position you want to put yourself in. If you know your opponent's going to be able to deal with your aerial as soon as it comes into play, play something else on turn 3. Go aggro, go a different strategy. Maybe your opponent has something that he can deal 3 damage with that's going to threaten your aerial. However, something with 3 damage isn't going to threaten something like Daisy Duck. So maybe on that turn, even though it's only taking advantage of one of your resources, the better play is develop a Daisy Duck, flush out some of that damage that your opponent is going to be putting towards you, and then get your aerial in play. So always kind of think about that strategy when you're playing. Don't just jump into like, this is what my deck is supposed to do. Steel Song plays aerial on 3, this is what I'm going to do. So always try to think through your turns and make the best possible choice you can at any given moment. So that is my 5 top tips for being an effective deck builder and Lorcana player in general. Like I mentioned, if this video gets 50 likes, we're going to look at doing some more kind of intermediate level tips and maybe some more advanced tips going forward. So if you'd like to see more of this kind of content on the channel, dropping those likes, hitting the subscribe button helps us out a ton. And remember, when you see those toys, video games, and more effective deck building off in the distance, it is not a mirage. You guys have a great day.